Africa ditching the US dollar and CFA franc, implications for France and the US economies. Africa is undergoing a seismic economic and geopolitical shift. As countries across the continent push to ditch the US dollar in global trade and the CFA franc in domestic transactions, the implications reach far beyond African borders. This transition challenges centuries-old financial systems and colonial legacies and has deep consequences for the global economic architecture, particularly for the United States and France. While the US dollar has long been the anchor of global commerce, and the CFA franc a symbol of French influence in West and Central Africa, both are now under unprecedented scrutiny. Africa's pursuit of monetary sovereignty, spurred by growing Pan-Africanism, economic nationalism, and shifting global alliances, could ultimately reshape the balance of power in the 21st century. Historical background of monetary colonialism. Origins of the CFA franc. The CFA franc was created in 1945 by France for its colonies in West and Central Africa. Originally pegged to the French franc and later to the euro, it was designed to tie the economies of the colonies to France. Over time, although some reforms occurred, the core structure remained the same: reserves held in France, monetary policy dictated externally, and strict convertibility mechanisms ensuring dependence on French institutions. Dollarization in global trade. The US dollar became the world's reserve currency after World War II, institutionalized through the Bretton Woods system. Even after the collapse of Bretton Woods in the 1970s, the dollar retained dominance in energy markets, trade settlements, debt issuance, and global finance. African countries, like most others, have been heavily reliant on the dollar for imports, exports, debt servicing, and foreign reserves. Africa's growing push for currency sovereignty. Rising discontent with the CFA franc. In nations like Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Guinea, and Senegal, protests and political discourse increasingly center around the CFA franc's role as a symbol of neocolonialism. Leaders like Captain Ibrahim Traoré in Burkina Faso have positioned monetary independence as a cornerstone of true sovereignty. The role of BRICS and Global South alliances. The emergence of BRICS, particularly China and Russia, has offered African nations alternatives to the dollar-centric system. BRICS nations have proposed a new trade settlement system, bypassing the dollar, which has already been adopted in limited bilateral trade agreements. Launch of PAPS and OFCFTA. The Pan-African Payment and Settlement System, PAPS, launched by the African Export-Import Bank, enables intra-African trade in local currencies. Combined with the African Continental Free Trade Area, OFCFTA, it lays the foundation for reducing dollar dependency. The Eco Currency Project. West African nations have proposed replacing the CFA franc with a new regional currency, the Eco. Though delayed by political and economic hurdles, it signals a serious effort to move away from French monetary control. Please like and subscribe to keep this channel alive. Strategic drivers behind the shift. Political sovereignty. Monetary dependence limits foreign policy autonomy. By controlling its currency, a nation asserts its ability to make independent economic decisions, essential in the face of sanctions, military alliances, and geopolitical realignments. Economic flexibility. Using foreign currencies constrains fiscal and monetary policy. African countries are limited in their ability to stimulate their economies, respond to shocks, or tailor interest rates. Youth-led movements in Pan-Africanism. A new generation of Africans, mobilized by social media and Pan-African ideals, sees monetary liberation as part of the larger struggle against systemic injustice. Political rhetoric increasingly reflects this urgency. Effects on the French economy. Loss of financial leverage. The CFA franc system allows France to control a significant portion of Africa's foreign reserves. Ending this would eliminate a key source of cheap capital and global influence for Paris. Erosion of neocolonial influence. France's cultural and political ties to Francophone Africa rest in large part on economic control. Abandonment of the CFA would signal a weakening of French soft power and reduce its influence in global forums. Impact on French multinationals. Many French companies benefit from favorable trade and financial conditions in CFA countries. With independent currencies, pricing, taxation, and repatriation of profits may become more complex and costly. Strategic blow in geopolitical competition. As countries like China, Russia, and Turkey increase their footprint in Africa, France's loss of monetary leverage would make it harder to maintain its historical dominance in the region. Effects on the U.S. economy. Decline in dollar demand. If African countries begin settling trade in local currencies or BRICS alternatives, demand for the US dollar will diminish. This affects the dollar's value, borrowing costs, and global trade dynamics. Challenge to sanctions regimes. The US uses the dollar as a geopolitical weapon, enforcing sanctions by controlling dollar-based transactions. African nations moving off the dollar could create precedents that weaken this power. Impact on U.S. exports and financial markets. Less dollar use in African trade could marginally affect U.S. exports and reduce investment flows from Africa. Though not a large portion of U.S. trade, the symbolic shift could drive similar moves elsewhere. Recalibration of Bretton Woods institutions. If the dollar is no longer central to African economies, institutions like the IMF and World Bank, where the U.S. holds outsized power, will face pressure to democratize and reform. Chapter 6: Challenges facing African de-dollarization and CFA strategies. Currency volatility and inflation. New currencies often suffer from instability. Without credible central banks and disciplined fiscal policy, inflation could erode the benefits of monetary sovereignty. Political risk and military interference. Efforts to exit the CFA franc have historically been met with political destabilization. Critics argue that external actors including France have an interest in maintaining the status quo through covert means. Fragmented implementation. While the OFCTA and PAPs are promising, implementation is inconsistent. Political rivalries, logistical limitations, and trust deficits hinder coordination across the continent. External debt and dollar obligations. Even if Africa shifts to new currencies, most of its sovereign debt is denominated in dollars or euros. This limits how quickly African nations can pivot without risking default or downgrades. Global implications and new geopolitical alignments. Africa as a model for the Global South. If successful, Africa's break from the dollar and CFA franc could inspire Latin America, Southeast Asia, and other regions to pursue monetary sovereignty. Redefinition of global reserve currencies. Africa's actions could contribute to a more multipolar monetary order, where no single currency dominates. This rebalancing would reflect the world's economic diversity more accurately. Please like and subscribe to keep this channel alive. Role of digital currencies and blockchain. Technological tools like central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, stablecoins, and blockchain platforms could support Africa's move away from traditional currencies and help leapfrog infrastructural gaps. Conclusion. Africa's decision to shed the US dollar and CFA franc is not merely an economic maneuver, it's a declaration of independence from systems of control rooted in colonialism and economic coercion. As the continent moves to reclaim its monetary destiny, the shockwaves will be felt in Paris and Washington, D.C., where leaders must reckon with the erosion of financial influence. While the road ahead is fraught with risks from inflation to political pushbacks, the momentum is unmistakable. Africa is no longer content to be a passive participant in the global economy. It is demanding a new seat at the table on its own terms.